Hi, thank you for purchasing my pattern. So this is the Balloon Fiesta picnic blanket, and there's also the Skies Over Bristol pram blanket, which is just a smaller version of it. I'd like to show you how to pick up stitches along the edge of the balloon motif. So that would be these rows here, these garter stitch rows in between the columns of the balloons, and then I'd like to knit another balloon or half a balloon and show you how to join as you go. So it's all easily explained. So there's my first balloon ready. Imagine that it was one of the whole sort of first strip of balloons. This board is only added at the end, so you have this column which goes all the way to the top. For the Skies Over Bristol, that's 5 balloons high, and for the Balloon Fiesta picnic blanket, that'd be 8 balloons high. Then you have this column, and the next thing that you would do is to pick up stitches along the edge to knit these garter stitch rows. So let's get going. I've only got one column, so only 1 balloon high, but the principle is of course exactly the same. I'm just going to be using light blue for this demonstration. Each balloon motif is 52 stitches high, and you will be picking up 26 stitches for each balloon. If you're picking up on every other row, then it's worth looking at the edge of the garter stitch, and if I pull it slightly, you can probably see that between each of these sort of bumps there's a strand. I'll just put my needle under it there for you to see, and you're going to be picking up under that strand, and that will mean that you're picking up on every other row. 26 stitches for every balloon motif, and that makes 130 stitches for the Skies Over Bristol and 208 stitches along the edge of the balloon strip for the Balloon Fiesta picnic blanket. So picking up stitches along an edge is really simple. Between that sort of rounded, say, garter stitch bump and that rounded garter stitch bump is a strand. I take my 4.5mm circular needle, which is a US size 7, and I take it under that strand, lay the yarn over and pick up a stitch, and then I just move along to the next strand, which is sometimes a little bit complicated due to the garter stitch design, and I literally just pick up a stitch there. So I'll keep going. 3. I'm weaving in the yarn as I go. I'll explain that in a minute. 4, 5. So after the basket motif, on the first balloon, obviously that one is blue or background colour, so you won't have any basket there. You can just pick up every other row, but then when you have the basket knitted, it's easy to see, you know, where the balloon is finished. So where the 10th row is, that'll be 5 stitches, and then you can carry on. But let's just continue like this. So that's 5, then there's another 1, 6. Now weaving in is easy. You take the strand, the end, the loose end, and you just lay it over the needle, and then you knit the stitch, but don't incorporate that strand, just take it back down again when you bring the stitch through. And when you then pick up the next stitch without laying the strand over, then it sort of locks it in, and that's called weaving in. Maybe that should be a separate tutorial, but for those of you who've seen it once before, that's just how to do it. Otherwise you could leave it at the bottom and just weave it in the normal way. So I'll keep going. 7, under the strand, knit the stitch. 8, 9. So I think they are really very easy to see. Purl bump, and in between the purl bump, the strand. And that's where the stitch gets picked up. So I'll go a bit faster now. Now the reason that you use a 4.5mm needle is because for garter stitch you have many more rows than you have stitches on a tension square, and these rows are knitted sideways to the direction of knitting of the balloon motifs, and that just works out better on a needle size that's one size up. So 26, that's great. And then when you turn and knit the other way, then you end up with these rows of purl bumps. So 5 rows means that you see three rows of bumps. So now I'm at the stage where I've with the right side facing, picked up 26 stitches for each balloon motif, and then I've knitted 5 rows in garter stitch with the 4.5mm needles, and now I'm taking the double pointed needles 4mm, so US size 6, and I'm going to start column 2, and column 2 starts with a half balloon, which is wider at the bottom, so as if you'd started halfway up a balloon, just the top half. It starts there because the balloons are staggered. And so I need to cast on 19 stitches to start the first row of the second column, which on the blanket, if you have a look, that's here. So the border's been added afterwards. It's this stretch of 19 stitches. Now the half balloon, which starts at the wider, with a wider point, has an extra chart in the pattern because I've done something just very slightly different when I've knitted it to, if you'd started halfway up the balloon. But just to make it obvious, which shape it is, I've started and called the first row 27, so don't get confused there. And if you did just do the top part of the chart, my goodness, it really wouldn't matter too much. So, casting on 19 stitches very easily, I'm casting them onto the 4mm needles. So this looks much more fiddly than it really is. Now I can use the knit on cast on because I am after all going to pick up stitches along this bottom edge afterwards in order to add the border, and so that could be a nice edge that I could use. You could also use the cable cast on, or you could turn your work and use the backward loop if you liked, but that is can be a little bit loose sometimes. So what am I doing? 3, 6, 9, 10. 13, 14, 15, 16, 19. So I have 19 stitches on my 4mm needles, and I have here my 4.5mm needles, and I'm going to start knitting this balloon in this direction going upwards using these stitches. What I've done all the way through the blanket is I've merely slipped half of the balloon stitches, so 13 stitches at a time, onto the 4mm needle because it makes things easier for me. And I feel that there's enough space for that. So that's what I'm going to do now. 1, 2, 3. So I slip purlwise 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So then I can pull the 4.5mm, the thicker circular needle out like this, so it doesn't get in my way. I have the stitches that I'm going to join, ready, and in a way, once I've done the first one, I don't have to count so much because you'll see there's always a little gap between the balloon stitches and these sort of garter edge stitches. But that's down to experience, and what I could also do is I could just clip a little stitch marker in there to remind me where this first stitch is. So, you know, I could attach a stitch marker there that's telling me, oh, that's the first stitch that I have to purl together. Now, so this is row 27. On the normal chart it would have an increase in it, but in the half balloon chart it doesn't. I've started with 19 stitches so that I have the full width of this column at the bottom. So I knit 18, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18 stitches, and then I'm going to take the stitch marker out. I bring the yarn forward, and what I do is I purl together the last stitch of the balloon motif together with the first stitch that was on the circular needles previously. So just purl 2 together, and then I turn my work. With the yarn held in back, I slip the first one knitwise, and then I just knit to the end of the row. So this is row 28. So row 29. Row 29, I've knitted 18 stitches. I take the yarn forward, and then I purl the last stitch of the balloon together with the first stitch that was previously on the circular needle. Then I turn my work again with the yarn held in back. I slip the first stitch knitwise and knit to end. And now you can probably see what I mean, that there's this gap between the last balloon stitch and the first stitch that was previously on the circular needle, the garter stitch edge. So I bring the yarn forward and purl those two together. I turn the work, slip the first stitch knitwise with the yarn in back. When I slip that stitch, I like to give it a little tug, just hold the tension even, so that I don't have any large gaps forming there. And then I just knit back the other way. Reached row 51, I have 9 stitches left at the top of the balloon motif and one of the garter edge stitches that I've slipped onto the 4mm needle. So as I said before, I've been personally knitting one and then doing the slip slip knit, but I did originally do the slip slip knit right at the very beginning of the row, so never mind, whichever way you want to do it. It's charted on the edge. So that's the decrease at the beginning of the row. And have I done one too many? No. I have 3 balloon stitches left and 1 edge stitch left, so I knit 2 together. Then I take the yarn forward and purl these 2 together. So now that's row 51. Row 52, I slip one knitwise with the yarn held in back and knit to the end of the row. And now I'm ready to start the next balloon. So the next balloon would take shape like so. So here I have my 2 colours for the balloon basket. And I'm going to start with the brown. Now again, I do actually weave in as I knit the first row, and the way I do that is, oh yes, that's right, I still have these stitches on the 4.5mm circular needle, and it's worth then slipping them across. So this would be for rows 1 to 26. I'm slipping these 13 stitches across at a time. It's just too fiddly trying to knit together from the circular needle on every single row. So I'm starting the brown for the balloon basket. I've already cut off the background colour, and I just knit the first stitch pinching the brown yarn in the back, and then I personally weave in both colours. I think some people would only weave in one colour, but I find it works this way. So every other stitch I put the needle into the stitch, then I lay both of the loose yarns over. I knit the stitch, but then I take those loose yarns down and don't incorporate them in the stitch itself. They're just at the back. And when I then knit the next stitch, you can see they trap there. So let me show you that one more time. I go into the stitch knitwise and I lay those loose yarns over. I wrap the yarn around the needle, but then I take those loose yarns down, and when I then perform the next stitch, which in this case is the purl two together, then the yarn is trapped at the back of the work. Sometimes this first stitch can become a bit loose, but what you can then do is to take the tail and just tug a bit. You shouldn't really, because it deforms the work, but sometimes you need to. So I hold the yarn in back and slip the first stitch knitwise, and then I knit to the end of the row. And then the next row, row 3, is the first repeat of the slip stitch pattern. You can't actually weave the yarns if you're doing the slip stitch pattern, you just have to weave them in afterwards with the needle. So the slip stitch pattern is easy. You knit one stitch in this second colour, then you slip the next stitch purlwise, knit one, slip one purlwise, knit one, slip one purlwise, and then knit two together. And if the balloons are not in the background colour, then it's very easy to see which are the garter stitch edges and which are the balloon stitches. Slip one with yarn in back and knit to the end of the row. So by making the baskets all uniform, I can easily tell them apart. So if you look at the blanket, then you immediately see, oh, these are baskets. So I drop the old yarn in front and pick up the new yarn at the back. That's the convention when you're knitting stripes, two row stripes. And the next rows, so row 5, is different. You slip the first stitch purlwise and then knit the next stitch, slip on purlwise, knit, slip on purlwise, knit, and then yarn forward, purl two together. I'll show you the basket slip stitch pattern first, and then you'll see that the purl two together join is really quite neat. So the old yarn is dropped in front, the new yarn is picked up behind, and now it's similar to row 3. I knit the first stitch, slip one purlwise, knit the next stitch, slip one purlwise, knit, slip purlwise, and then purl the last 2 stitches together. Slip one purlwise with knitwise with the yarn in back, knit to the end of the row. So that was row 8. Row 9 is easy. I drop the old yarn in front, I pick the new yarn up at the back, and then I knit 2 rows in the brown, and that ends the balloon basket. Now on this row you could weave in the paler colour, like so. Because you're no longer doing a slip stitch pattern, it's possible to weave. Purl 2 together, oops, wrong one, yarn in back, slip one knitwise, knit to the end of the row. So that ends the balloon basket. I can cut the yarns and then weave them in later. I do so after every 3 or 4 balloons. And now I'm going to continue in the balloon colour, the same as that one, but never mind. Purl 2 together. Turn, slip 1 knitwise, even out the tension and knit to the end of the row. Bit of a loose stitch there. Now the first increase. Now I've not shown you an increase before, so maybe it's worth me working this row together with you. Knit 1, knit into the front of the stitch, swing round and knit into the back leg of the same stitch and take the yarn off the needles. So I knit to the second last stitch and I do the same again. I knit into the front of the stitch, then I swing round and I put my needle knitwise into the back leg of the same stitch and form a stitch out of the back of the stitch as well. That's the knit front back increase. Purl 2 together. Bit of a loose stitch there. Right. When you're knitting, you might notice that some of the colours show there when you're purling 2 together, but if you look at the overall blanket, that's not noticeable. I hope you really enjoy this fun, colourful product, and thank you for purchasing from Knitting Emporium. See you again. Bye.